The out of Africa migration. Around 60 to 70,000 years ago, small groups of Homo sapiens left East Africa and began moving into the wider world. At that time, there may have been only a few thousand breeding individuals left, and survival was not guaranteed. But these early humans carried tools, fire, language, and the ability to adapt to new climates better than any other species. First, they crossed the Red Sea into Arabia, then gradually along the coasts of South Asia, reaching Australia by about 50,000 years ago. Others pushed north into Europe and Central Asia, where they met Neanderthals and Denisovans. Rather than wiping them all out, DNA shows interbreeding took place. Today, all non-African populations carry 1 to 4% Neanderthal DNA. By about 12,000 years ago, humans had spread to every continent except Antarctica. This single migration didn't just shape history, it is history. Every language, culture, and nation traces back to those bands of explorers who walked out of Africa with nothing more than courage, curiosity, and the ability to dream further. Indo-European expansion. One of the most important migrations in all of human history, because it shaped the languages spoken by nearly 3 billion people today, from English to Hindi, Russian to Persian. It began around 4000 BCE on the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the grasslands north of the Black and Caspian Seas. Semi-nomadic herders lived with cattle and sheep, but their true advantage was the domestication of the horse and the invention of wheeled vehicles. These innovations gave them unmatched mobility and military power. Over the next 3 millennia, waves of Indo-European groups spread out. Some pushed west into Europe, becoming the ancestors of Celtic, Germanic, Greek, and Latin-speaking peoples. Others moved south into Persia and India, giving rise to the Iranian tribes and Indo-Aryans, who introduced Sanskrit and early Vedic culture. More branches stretched east into Central Asia. The results were staggering. Entire regions were linguistically transformed, old cultures absorbed, and new civilizations emerged. Even today, the vast majority of Europe and South Asia speaks languages descended from those steppe migrants. In short, the Indo-European expansion wasn't just a migration. It built the shared linguistic foundation of much of the modern world. The Bantu migrations, one of the largest and longest population movements in history, unfolding over nearly 2,000 years and reshaping the entire map of Africa. It began around 1000 BCE in what is now southeastern Nigeria and Cameroon. Small groups of Bantu-speaking farmers and ironworkers started moving south and east. Why? Mainly for better farmland, new resources, and to ease growing population pressure. But their advantage was technology. They spread iron tools and agriculture, especially crops like bananas and yams, which supported larger communities than traditional hunter-gathering. Over the centuries, these waves of people gradually reached Central, Eastern, and Southern Africa, mixing with or displacing local groups such as Pygmy and Khoisan communities. Culturally, they carried their languages with them. Today, over 500 related Bantu languages are spoken by about 1/3 of all Africans, from Swahili in the east to Zulu in the south. The impact was enormous. Farming economies replaced foraging, iron technology spread across the continent, and shared linguistic roots tied together vast regions of Africa. In short, the Bantu migrations didn't just move people. They transformed Africa's language, culture, and genetics forever. The Jewish Diaspora, one of the most enduring migrations in human history, not by choice, but through repeated waves of exile and dispersal. It began in 586 BCE, when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem's first temple and forced thousands of Jews into captivity. Though some later returned, dispersal became permanent after 70 CE, when the Romans crushed the Great Jewish Revolt and destroyed the Second Temple. Survivors were scattered across the Roman Empire, from the Middle East to North Africa and Europe. Despite exile, Jewish communities kept their identity through religion, tradition, and language. They adapted to local cultures, speaking Greek, Arabic, Yiddish, Ladino, yet remained tied to shared faith and memory of Israel. Over centuries, migrations continued. Some were driven by persecution and expulsions in Europe and the Middle East, while others were voluntary, seeking trade and opportunity. By modern times, Jewish communities existed across every continent. Today, about 15 million Jews live worldwide, with major populations in Israel and the United States. The diaspora's greatest legacy is resilience, a people maintaining culture and faith over millennia of displacement, proving that identity can survive borders, empires, and centuries apart. The migration period or the barbarian invasions, the great shuffle that ended the Roman world and gave birth to medieval Europe. It began around the 4th century CE, as pressure built along the Roman Empire's borders. Germanic tribes like the Goths, Vandals, and Lombards were pushed westward, often by even larger forces, most famously the Huns, who thundered into Europe from the steppes of Central Asia. By the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was overwhelmed. In 410 CE, the Visigoths under Alaric famously sacked Rome. Soon after, Vandals swept into North Africa, Angles and Saxons invaded Britain, and Franks settled in Gaul, the foundations of modern France and Germany. These migrations weren't just violent invasions. They were long-term settlements that fused Roman traditions with new cultures. Over centuries, Europe's map was remade, Latin blended into Romance languages, Christianity spread among newcomers, and kingdoms rose that would dominate the Middle Ages. So while Rome fell, Europe didn't collapse into chaos, it transformed. The migration period turned wandering tribes into the ancestors of modern European nations. The Viking migrations, not just raids, they were an expansion that reshaped Europe from coast to coast. Beginning in the late 700s, Norse seafarers from present-day Norway, Denmark, and Sweden used their advanced longships to travel astonishing distances. In 793 CE, their first notorious raid struck Lindisfarne Monastery in England, shocking Christian Europe. Soon, Viking fleets were pushing deep into Britain and Ireland, eventually settling in founding towns like Dublin. Across the Channel, Vikings carved out territory in France, known as Normandy, land of the Northmen. They sailed through river systems into Russia, where they became traders and rulers, laying foundations for the rise of Kievan Rus. Others ventured further still, across the North Atlantic to settle Iceland, Greenland, and even reach Vinland in North America, nearly 500 years before Columbus. But these weren't just warlords. Many Vikings settled, farmed, and integrated, blending with local cultures. Their legacy survives in language, genetics, and place names across Europe. The Viking migrations proved that mobility and sea power could redraw maps, leaving an imprint from Canada's shores to Russia's heartlands. The Mongol expansion. It was the fastest rise of an empire the world had ever seen, and it redrew the map of Eurasia. It began in the early 1200s, when Temujin, later known as Genghis Khan, united the nomadic tribes of Mongolia. Their secret weapons were exceptional horsemanship, brilliant tactics, and composite bows that could strike from hundreds of meters while riding at full speed. From there, the Mongols exploded outward. They conquered China's Jin dynasty, swept into Persia, and crushed Kievan Rus. By mid-13th century, their empire stretched from the Korean peninsula to Eastern Europe, the largest contiguous empire in history, covering over 22% of the Earth's land. But conquest also meant movement. Entire populations were relocated, enslaved, or integrated, and the vast trade network known as the Pax Mongolica connected east and west. Merchants, scholars, and technologists, even gunpowder and printing, flowed across Mongol lands. The empire even helped spread the Black Death, carried along their trade routes into Europe. By the late 14th century, the empire fractured, but its impact endured. New states rose in Russia, China, and the Middle East, while global trade and cross-cultural contact reached levels never seen before. The Mongol migrations weren't just invasions. They were the engine behind the first truly interconnected world. The Atlantic slave trade, one of the largest forced migrations in human history, and one of the most tragic. From the 1500s to the 1800s, European powers built a vast system that uprooted over 12 million Africans. Captives were taken from West and Central Africa, often through raids or wars, and forced onto ships bound for the Americas in what became known as the Middle Passage. Conditions were horrific: crowded holds, disease, starvation, and up to 20% died before even reaching shore. Those who survived were sold into slavery on plantations in the Caribbean, Brazil, and North America, producing sugar, cotton, and tobacco that fueled European wealth. Africa, meanwhile, was devastated, millions lost, communities fractured, and economies destabilized. Yet enslaved Africans also carried with them resilience, traditions, and culture. Their music, foodways, and faith blended across the Americas, creating new cultural identities, from Afro-Brazilian to African-American. By the 19th century, abolition movements finally ended the trade, but its legacy remains permanent, shaping the demographics of 3 continents and leaving a painful history of racism and inequality that's still felt today. The Atlantic slave trade wasn't just migration. It was survival in the face of humanity's darkest system. European colonization of the Americas, one of the most transformative migrations in history, and one of the most destructive. Beginning with Spain and Portugal in the late 1400s, waves of settlers, soldiers, and missionaries crossed the Atlantic. Soon, Britain, France, and the Netherlands followed, establishing colonies from Canada to the Caribbean to South America. By the 1600s and 1700s, millions of Europeans had crossed the ocean, bringing with them new crops, technology, and animals, but also weapons and devastating diseases. For indigenous peoples, the impact was catastrophic. Smallpox and other epidemics killed an estimated 80 to 90% of native populations, while wars, displacement, and forced conversions destroyed countless societies. At the same time, colonizers imported African slaves to build plantation economies, tying the Americas into a global trade network. But the migrations also forged new worlds. Spanish and Portuguese settlers reshaped Latin America with language and Catholicism. English and French colonies in North America laid the foundations for modern Canada and the United States. By the 19th century, European colonization had permanently redrawn the Americas' demographics, cultures, and power structures. It was a collision of worlds that created the world we live in today. The Great Migration of African Americans, one of the most significant population shifts in U.S. history, and it reshaped the nation's identity. Between 1910 and 1970, over 6 million African Americans left the segregated rural South, escaping Jim Crow laws, violence, and economic oppression. They boarded trains and buses heading north and west, searching for safety, jobs, and dignity. Cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philadelphia, and later Los Angeles became new centers of black life. In the North, many found factory work during both world wars, fueling America's industrial boom. Life wasn't easy, racial discrimination continued, but communities built opportunity out of struggle. The cultural impact was profound. The Harlem Renaissance redefined literature and art. Jazz, blues, and gospel transformed American music. Politically, black voters in northern cities gained new power, helping drive the civil rights movement by the 1950s and 60s. By the end of the migration, African Americans had permanently shifted America's demographics, economy, politics, and culture. It was more than movement, it was transformation. The Great Migration turned hardship into creativity and laid the foundation for modern Black America. The Partition of India in 1947 was one of the largest and bloodiest migrations in human history. When the British left South Asia after nearly 2 centuries of rule, the colony was divided into 2 nations, Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan. The decision was rushed, the borders hastily drawn. Overnight, some 14 to 15 million people, Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs, were forced to migrate across the new lines, seeking safety in what they hoped was their own country. On trains, roads, and by foot, families carried whatever they could. But the transition was accompanied by brutal violence, massacres, forced conversions, arson, and horrific assaults. Historians estimate 1 to 2 million deaths in only a few months' time. Entire villages were destroyed, and ancient communities uprooted forever. The scars of partition still shape South Asia today. It cemented the rivalry between India and Pakistan, sparked wars, and set the stage for the ongoing conflict over Kashmir. For survivors, it was not just migration, it was trauma passed down through generations. The partition wasn't just the birth of 2 nations. It was proof that new lines on a map can unravel millions of lives in an instant. World War II refugee migrations. It didn't just kill tens of millions, it also uprooted them. Between 1939 and 1949, the war and its aftermath created one of the largest refugee crises in history. Across Europe, constant shifting battle lines and Nazi occupation forced civilians to flee by the millions. Jewish families were deported into ghettos and camps, with only a fraction surviving. After liberation, many had no homes to return to, and tens of thousands sought refuge in Palestine or the United States. Meanwhile, as the war ended, entire nations were on the move. Over 12 million ethnic Germans were expelled from Eastern Europe into a shattered Germany. Poles, Ukrainians, and Balts were displaced as borders shifted westward under Soviet control. Camps for displaced persons stretched across Germany, Austria, and Italy, housing millions awaiting resettlement. Altogether, historians estimate at least 20 to 30 million people were displaced in Europe during and after the war. Their journeys reshaped countries, redrew ethnic maps, and gave birth to modern refugee law, including the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the 1951 Refugee Convention. The Second World War's battlefields eventually recovered, but the migrations it unleashed left scars across families, nations, and even international law that remain today. The Palestinian Nakba. In 1948, the creation of Israel triggered the Nakba, or catastrophe in Arabic, the mass displacement of Palestinians that continues to shape the Middle East. When Britain ended its rule in Palestine, the United Nations proposed partition, a Jewish and an Arab state. War followed. Jewish militias fought Arab forces, and as the conflict intensified, over 700,000 Palestinian Arabs were forced from their homes. Some fled in fear, Others were expelled during battles, and entire villages were destroyed or depopulated. Most refugees ended up in West Bank, Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, where camps quickly swelled. Generations grew up stateless, often denied citizenship or full rights. Meanwhile, Israel absorbed Jewish migrants and Holocaust survivors, solidifying its new statehood but deepening the refugee crisis for Palestinians. Today, that original 700,000 has grown to over 5 million registered refugees, many still living in camps. The Nakba remains central to Palestinian national identity and to the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It wasn't just a migration. It was a permanent rupture, turning loss of land and home into a lasting struggle over history, justice, and the right of return. Syrian civil war refugee crisis. War has created the largest refugee crisis of the 21st century, symbolic of modern global displacement. Since fighting erupted in 2011, Syria has been torn apart by conflict between the government, rebel groups, ISIS, and foreign powers. Cities like Aleppo, Homs, and Raqqa, once full of families and culture, were reduced to ruins by bombing, sieges, and chemical attacks. The human cost has been staggering. More than 6.5 million Syrians have fled the country, while another 6 million remain displaced inside Syria. Most fled to nearby countries. Turkey hosts over 3.6 million, while Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt have absorbed millions more. Hundreds of thousands undertook dangerous journeys to Europe, sparking political debates over immigration and asylum that changed European politics. For Syrians, life in exile often means struggling with poverty, restricted rights, and statelessness. For the world, the crisis revealed how fragile international refugee protections can be when scale overwhelms capacity. The Syrian refugee crisis is not just numbers. Its families are uprooted for over a decade, millions still waiting for safety, dignity, and a chance to rebuild their lives. Climate-driven future migrations. The next great migration isn't in the past. It's happening right now, and it's driven by climate change. As seas rise, droughts spread, and storms intensify, entire regions are becoming unlivable. The UN estimates that by 2050, 200 to 250 million people could be displaced by climate-related factors, more than the population of Brazil. Low-lying nations like Bangladesh, Pacific Island states, and coastal cities face flooding from sea level rise. In sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East, prolonged drought is already destroying farmland, pushing families into cities or cross borders. Wildfires, extreme heat, and resource scarcity are disrupting livelihoods in wealthy nations as well, from California to Australia. Unlike past migrations, this one isn't optional. People are leaving not for opportunity, but for survival. And unlike wars, climate migration has no end date. It grows worse every year without action. The question isn't whether climate migration will reshape the 21st century. It's how governments and societies will respond. In a sense, climate change may become the single largest driver of human movement in history.